case you forgot, we're still in Acts chapter 23. Where were we and where are we headed? We're now in chapter 23, moving from the Sanhedrin to Caesarea. There'll be no Sunday school on the 28th or the 18th or the 25th. And then that's supposed to say September 1st. We're going to start the book of Judges. That's changed because of me missing last week. And so we'll do the book of Judges whenever the book of Acts is done. But I would encourage you to please read ahead. Last time, Paul was accused of taking a Gentile inside of the temple, and we talked about that engraving where they said, if a foreigner comes inside the temple proper as opposed to the court of the Gentiles, he's going to die. Well, the Jews weren't worried about killing whoever was supposed to go with Paul. They wanted to get to Paul, even though this is talking about the Gentile is going to die. So that triggered a series of riots. The first one occurred in the temple proper when the Jews from Asia saw him there. Then they took him outside of the temple proper into the court of the Gentiles, and word travels like a wildfire, and all of Jerusalem is in confusion. The Roman soldiers come in, they arrested Paul, they take him from the court of the Gentiles in front of the Antonia fortress, and another riot gets fired up. And Paul has an opportunity to testify to the people because he's speaking with the tribune. And he gives this testimony, and he's moving right along, and he's making great progress until he drops the G word. And when that happens, everything goes crazy again. Another riot in front of the fortress, and Paul goes to jail one night over, and the next day, we're now up to chapter 23. He goes into the Sanhedrin, and once again, another riot. So he broke all records. You know, we've had some riots in this country, different cities, this, that, and the other. Paul had them all beat. We talked about some parallels between Jesus and Paul, and you'll see some other parallels as we continue the study. They were both tied to the same post, but they both had different stripes. Jesus had no stripes because he was the Lamb without spot or blemish, but Paul, by this point, had plenty of stripes. He had already been a living sacrifice, and he didn't give himself up just spiritually, he gave himself up physically. And his testimony was that I may know him and the power of his resurrection and the fellowship of his sufferings. I carried one of those this past week, and that's probably the most valuable document I own. When the centurion heard this, he went to the tribune and said to him, "What are you about to do?" Talking about the potential flogging. "For this man is a Roman citizen." So the tribune came and said to him, "Tell me, are you a Roman citizen?" And he said, "Yes." The tribune answered, "I bought this citizenship for a large sum." Paul said, "But I am a citizen by birth." So those who were about to examine him withdrew from him immediately, and the tribune also was afraid, for he realized that Paul was a Roman citizen and that he had bound him. So the tribune wants to find out why all this is happening, because he's going to have to give an answer for this series of riots that were going on, okay? So there's a picture of the Sanhedrin and the way the guys are all laid out. Just a few years prior, Jesus was standing as the accused. Just a few years prior, Stephen was standing as the accused. And Paul will testify that he was a member of the Sanhedrin. And now we're going to see Paul standing there as the accused. But on the next day, desiring to know the real reason why he was being accused by the Jews, the tribune unbound him and commanded the chief priests and all the council to meet. And he brought Paul down and set him before them. Now, there was a discussion here as to whether he insisted that the Sanhedrin come and meet at the Antonia fortress, or if the tribune took Paul down into that Sanhedrin chamber. So where was it? This is the letter that we're going to read later in the chapter, where Lysias, the tribune, is writing to Felix, the governor, explaining why he's sending Paul over to Caesarea. And desiring to know the charge for which they were accusing him, I brought him down to their council. So he took him down into that chamber, that meeting room. Now, that word council, translated in every leading translation except the Sanhedrin, is translated council. The NIV translates it from the Greek Sanhedrin. All right. So he's down in the Sanhedrin, and looking intently at the council, Paul said, brothers, I have lived my life before God in all good conscience up to this day. And in those last few chapters, you see 7 opportunities that Paul had an opportunity not just to defend himself, but at the same time testify of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. 4, 5, and 6 become interesting ones. Felix says, I'm going to hear at a more convenient time. NIV says, when I have opportunity. Festus says, King James, much learning doth make thee mad. And Agrippa says, in a little bit of time. King James translated that almost persuaded, and we came up with the great hymn, Almost Persuaded, talking about being under the conviction of the Holy Spirit and yet still rejecting his saving grace. 3 interesting testimonies that we'll be covering over the next so many hours. And the high priest Ananias, not Annas, commanded those who stood by him to strike him on the mouth. Now, Annas was the high priest. Roll back a couple of years when Jesus was in front of the Sanhedrin. It was Annas and Caiaphas. Now Annas has been replaced by Ananias. And even the Jewish literature will testify of the corruption during this particular period. They call it the Second Temple period. And this guy Ananias was so faithful to the Romans that in 66 AD, when the rebellion started back up, it was the Jewish people that killed Ananias. It wasn't the Romans. This guy had sold himself out so much to the Romans that they did him in. He was corrupt. He was cruel. He sold himself out, and he was killed by his own people. Then Paul said to him, God is going to strike you, you whitewashed wall. Are you sitting to me according to the law, and yet contrary to the law, you order me to be struck? Now, that's in contrast to what he wrote in 1 Corinthians chapter 14. When reviled, we bless. When persecuted, we endured. He also wrote this. And the flesh lusteth against the spirit, and the spirit against the flesh, so that you cannot do the things that you would. Now, the order of this is very important. The lust, the flesh, lusting after the spirit. If I'm in traffic and somebody cuts me out, the first thing I don't do is sing Victory in Jesus. The first thing I'm tempted to do is to say something cruel or to think something terrible, because it's the flesh that acts up first. And so there's a battle that we all have, the flesh after the spirit and the spirit after the flesh. And ultimately, you've got to say, God, I hope that guy gets home safely. Those who stood by said, would you revile the God's high priest? And Paul said, I did not know, brothers, that he was the high priest. The JTS version is, I lost my head. At any rate, now when Paul perceived that one part were Sadducees and the other were Pharisees, he cried out in the council, brothers, I am a Pharisee, son of a Pharisee. It is with respect to the hope and the resurrection of the dead that I'm on trial. Of course, this same divide and conquer technique has been used several times because the Pharisees and the Sadducees hated each other. If you want to read how badly they hated each other, go to kabod.org and just type in the search engine, Pharisees, Sadducees. These guys were at each other's throats all the time. So they were together when Paul was coming in, but then Paul drove that wedge. He said, it is in respect to the hope and the resurrection of the dead that I'm on trial. And when he had said this, a dissension arose between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. For the Sadducees said that there is no resurrection, no angel, no spirit, but the Pharisees acknowledged them all. The Pharisees acknowledged the entire Torah and the rest of the Old Testament. The Sadducees didn't care for the rest of the Old Testament, and they also on purpose changed some of the order keep in mind the way they did things was very methodical. In terms of a protest, they changed some of the orders just to be in the face of the Pharisees. So Paul knew exactly how to get between them. Then a great clamor arose, and some of the scribes of the Pharisees' party stood up and contended sharply, "We find nothing wrong in this man." Does that sound familiar? It's another parallel. Pilate said to the chief priest and to the people, "I find no fault in this man." So if there was no fault, and the scribe would be equivalent to the chief prosecutor, the attorney general. And he says, "I'm not going to press charges." But that didn't matter. And when the dissension became violent, the tribune, afraid that Paul would be torn to pieces by them, commanded the soldiers to go down and take him away from among them by forcing and bringing him into the barracks. This is riot number 5, and this is another schematic of that Solomon's temple. Right there is where the Sanhedrin met. The picture shows you the temple proper, and the Gentiles, if they were to go inside that rectangle, the broader rectangle there, they were going to die. Where was the tribune? He was inside that chamber of the hewn stone. Where were the soldiers coming? They were outside the court of the Gentiles, and they went inside there against the Jewish thing. The Jewish people lost a lot of their power. The following night, the Lord stood by him. So now he's in jail the second night in a row, keeping in mind the Spirit had told him that he had bondage and affliction to look forward to. The following night, the Lord stood by him and said, "Take courage, for as you have testified to the facts about me in Jerusalem, you must testify also in Rome." A couple of points here. When things seem impossible, the Lord intervenes. Now, I'm not much for television, but once upon a time, there was a show, MacGyver, and that guy got into the most horrible predicaments, and somehow, some way, Swiss Army knife, Inspector Gadget, whatever it was, he managed to get out. God's got MacGyver beat hands down. His plans are bigger than our imagination, both here and now and then and there. And in times of trouble, the Lord appears. He appeared for Paul in person. He appears to us in his word. So before we get into the conspiracy, I want to talk a little bit about Paul's family ties, or his family unties, as it were. An unlikely ally, his nephew. Some notes about Paul's family. So first of all, he had a sister and a nephew, and we're going to read about this, verse 16, chapter 23. Now the son of Paul's sister heard of their ambush, so he went and entered the barracks and told Paul. We'll get to that particular story. At one point, Paul most likely had a wife, and that's probably not news to most people here, but he possibly had children. This was new to me as I'm doing this research for our study. And where do I come up with this stuff? Okay. Chabad.org. Look at the red. This is the qualifications to be a member of the Sanhedrin. He could not be too old or childless when appointed, since someone with a family is more likely to be sympathetic and merciful. And I look at that and I think of our own New Testament qualifications for an elder and for a bishop. And it talks about the husband of one wife and to keep his family under subjection. And so you can see how these things came from the Jewish economy into the Christian economy, and they made sense. This comes more authority because this guy, Rabbi Kaplan, is like the word. He says, a person who is very old may not sit on the Sanhedrin since he is apt to be too severe. The same is true of a man who is sterile or even childless. So, is it possible that Paul had a wife? Yes. Is it possible that he had kids? Yes. What happens when a Jewish family has somebody in their family receiving Jesus Christ? They're cut off. We'll get to that. When it was day, the Jews made a plot and bound themselves by an oath, neither to eat nor drink till they had killed Paul. And there were more than 40 who made this conspiracy. They went to the chief priests and elders and said, "We have strictly bound ourselves by an oath to taste no food till we have killed Paul. Now, therefore, you, along with the council, give notice to the tribune to bring him down to you, as though you were going to determine his case more exactly, and we are ready to kill him before he comes near." Now, the sister of Paul's, the son of Paul's sister heard of their ambush, so he went and entered the barracks and told Paul. Now, we're going to see in a little bit that this could have been a young guy, because when the nephew finally gets the tribune puts his hand on him and he says, "Okay, Sonny, tell me what you know." So how did this little kid find out about this conspiracy? You know the definition of the secret, right? It's to tell everybody, not to tell anybody. And so these 40 guys, they've got the conspiracy. You know, this kind of news travels very quickly. They're talking to their wives and said, "Don't bother cooking tonight because I'm going to not eat until tomorrow morning when I take care of Paul." And the women start talking, and this one woman hears, and she brings it home, and the son of this woman hears. And so what about the shunning that went on, that if Paul was supposedly cut off, he's nothing to them? Paul hadn't been in Jerusalem to meet with his family for a long time. This little guy may never have met his Uncle Paul. He may have been referred to as Uncle Saul. We don't know. And he may have been more interested in justice than in the tradition of cutting people off from their family ties. But at any rate, in God's providence, he decides to go and snitch. So he went and he entered the barracks and he told Paul. So did he check with his mom? We don't know, because the mom may very well have been part of the shunning side and said, "Oh, I shouldn't have said anything around Sonny." How was he allowed to visit Paul? Paul was in prison. Paul was a Roman citizen, and we're going to see that he was given certain privileges in the various prisons where he went. So Paul called one of the centurions and said, "Take this young man to the tribune, for he has something to tell him." Now, Paul's in a really interesting position. He's a prisoner, and he's going to tell the centurion. First of all, keep in mind the centurions and the tribune, they were all scared to death because they had ordered a flogging of a Roman citizen. So they're going to start giving some leniency here. Paul called and said, "Take this young man to the tribune." So he took him and brought him to the tribune and said, "Paul, the prisoner, called me and asked me to bring this young man to you as he has something to say to you." And the tribune took him by the hand and, going aside, asked him privately, "What is it that you have to tell me?" And he said, "The Jews have agreed to ask you to bring Paul down to the council, but do not be persuaded by them." Now, this is interesting, because if this is a young kid, he's not going to talk like this. He's going to say, "They're going to kill my Uncle Paul. Please take care of him." So we have no idea how old this kid was. We have no idea if Luke embellished the conversation because he's taking the words of a kid and giving them to us as adults. But suffice it to say, the little boy delivered the message, and the tribune has to protect his prisoner because the Roman citizens had rights. So the tribune dismissed the young man, charging him, "Tell no one that you have informed me of these things," including Mom. If Mom's on the shunning side, if he goes and tells Mom, they're going to change their plan. So tell no one that you've been here. 40 Jews versus 472 Romans. Then he called two of the centurions and said, "Get ready 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, 200 spearmen, and go as far as Caesarea at the third hour of the night." So 9 p.m., it gets dark. Everybody else is going to sleep, ready for the high priest to come and make his plea. And so when all this is going on, they're going to get out of town. Also provide a horse for Paul to ride and bring him safely to Felix the governor. God's thoughts and his ways are not ours, and his timing is not ours. You know, I've often said God's got this sick sense of humor. If I say, "God, please don't tell me to do this," he's going to go around. That's what he's going to tell me to do. But in Paul's case, God took care of Paul in a very strange sort of way. Paul, he was told in Corinth that people aren't going to bother you, and here he is about to get flayed. He was told that he was going to be in bondage and affliction, and that's happening. He was told he was going to go to Rome, and he wasn't going to go first class El Al. He was going to go on a prisoner's ship. So there's Paul on his horse being led out and given an escort out of Jerusalem. So Paul is escorted out of Jerusalem, and you can see there the 200 soldiers, the 70 horsemen, the 200 spearmen. So that comes to 470. They're not going to let 470 soldiers out without leaders. So the 2 centurions went along with 472 against the 40 conspirators. Now, the way they would march, the spearmen would be on the outside with their shields, and they'd be locked shield to shield with their spear pointing outwards. The men on the inside, if they sensed anything, they would raise their shields up, and they would make almost a prehistoric tank, protect themselves from arrows, protect themselves from soldiers, and Paul and the horsemen are on the middle of all this. And Claudius Lysias writes this letter. He says, Claudius Lysias, to His Excellency the Governor Felix, greetings. This man was seized by the Jews and was about to be killed by them when I came up to them. So now here is his testimony in writing. In a few more verses, we're going to see when Tertullus comes, he's a paid orator who's going to come and present the case against Paul in front of Felix. And there's a verse that's dropped in modern translations that gives the exact opposite testimony of what Lysias had written to Felix. Now, keep in mind, Felix is a Roman governor. Whose word is he going to take? The word of the tribune, somebody who commands 5,000 soldiers, or hearsay from a paid Jewish orator? And that's going to become an interesting situation because it will unveil the motivation Felix had for keeping Paul in prison for 2 years. So Lysias is saying, the violence was so bad that I had to rescue this guy because he was a Roman citizen. Keep in mind, he's also going to gloss over the fact that he was about to be flogged. He is not going to put that in writing. And desiring to know the charge for which they were accusing him, I brought him down to their council, and I found that he was being accused about questions of their law, but charged with nothing deserving death or even imprisonment. And when it was disclosed to me that there would be a plot against the man, I sent him to you at once, ordering his accusers also to state before you what they have against him. So this letter was given to one of the 2 centurions, surrounded by the 470 guys, and they're off at night, making their way to Caesarea. So the soldiers, according to their instructions, took Paul and brought him by night to Antipatris. That's sort of halfway between Jerusalem and Caesarea. You can see the map up there. And so what they do, when daybreak comes, they send the foot soldiers back and they let the cavalry go forward. At that point, there's less of a threat and more of speed. And so they get Paul to Caesarea. And on the next day, the foot soldiers return to the barracks, letting the horsemen go on with him. And when they had come to Caesarea and delivered the letter to the governor, they presented Paul also before him. And on reading the letter, he was asked what province he was from. Saul of Tarsus. Tarsus is a city inside of the province of Cilicia. And when he learned that he was from Cilicia, he said, I will give you a hearing when your accusers come. So the trial is being set up the same way our trials are set up. You get a subpoena and the witnesses come, and the defense attorney and the prosecuting attorney, they all get together. And he commanded him to be guarded in Herod's praetorium. He was guarded in the palace. He wasn't thrown into a dungeon. They had a dungeon there. He wasn't thrown into the dungeon. He was allowed to hang out for 2 years in the palace. And that brings us to chapter 24. You ever hear the phrase, eat your words? If they only ate their words, they starved to death. It's better not to make a vow than to make one and break it. And after 5 days, they're going to pull all this stuff together. And after 5 days, the high priest Ananias came down with some elders and a spokesperson, one Tertullus. His name means number 3. I don't know if that meant he was the third son, but at any rate, they laid before the governor their case against Paul. And when he had been summoned, Tertullus began to accuse him, saying, now, the JTSV says blah, 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 right? But what we're going to see in the blah, blah, blah is all lies based on half-truths. Now, a half-truth is not a half-lie. A half-truth is a big old lie. And my first pastor would say, if the devil can talk you into telling a little white lie, he can talk you into propping it up with a great big black one. So Tertullus starts off and he says, since through you we enjoy much peace. There was no peace, there were riots. And since by your foresight, most excellent Felix, reforms are being made for this nation. There were no reforms. What he was doing, he was pressing down on the people. He was corrupt. He was taking more taxes away from the people. He was anything but what this guy was trying to say. In every way and everywhere, we accept this with all gratitude. They'd rather put a knife in his back than talk to him. But to detain you no further, King James uses the word weary. I can imagine this guy, Felix, sitting and listening with a big old yawn. You got to be kidding me. Come to the point, right? So I don't make you any more weary. I beg you in your kindness to hear us briefly. And Felix is saying, yeah, I agree. Just say what you have to say. For we have found this man a plague, one who stirs up riots among all the Jews throughout the world, and he's a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. He even tried to profane the temple, but we seized him. This is the verse that's missing from ESV, NIV, NASB, but it's in King James. And so I have to scratch my head and say, well, why is that? So you go back, and a lot of times, like there's a verse that's in the book of Acts where the Ethiopian asks Philip to baptize him. He says, what doth hinder me to be baptized? And the verse that's missing is, if thou believest with all thine heart, thou mayest. Well, the modern translations, for the most part, looked at the most complete manuscripts as opposed to the oldest manuscripts. And in that particular case, the oldest manuscripts had that particular verse. But in this particular case, it's varied. And so one of the rules that you try to come up with to say this is in or this is out is which are the older ones. Well, there wasn't. The other rule that they use is which ones of the various ancient ones had more of it than this one. Well, it was basically a tie. But you can infer this from all of the verses that are around it. So in your scriptures, you might be missing verse 7. But the chief Captain Lysias came upon us and with great violence took him away out of our hands. Now, how does that conflict with what Lysias had to say in his letter or written testimony? This is what Lysias said. He said, this man was seized by the Jews and was about to be killed by them. So the written word of a Roman tribune versus the testimony of a paid Jewish orator. And by examining himself, you will be able to find out from him about everything of which we accuse him. The Jews also joined in the charge, affirming that all these things were so. Now, one of the things that's true in our courts today and was true then was hearsay doesn't count. You know, he said, she said. The eyewitnesses is what you need. And when Paul has an opportunity to give his defense, he's going to say, they said that I was profaning the temple. The guys who saw me should have been here. We're going to get to that. And when the governor had nodded to him to speak, Paul replied, knowing that for many years you have been a judge over this nation, I cheerfully make my defense. You can verify that it is not more than 12 days since I went up to worship in Jerusalem, and they did not find me disputing with anyone or stirring up a crowd, either in the temple or in the synagogues or in the city. So he's coming bullet by bullet, come back and saying, that's just not so. Neither can they prove to you what they now bring up against me. Now, keep in mind, Paul is the defense, and it's the prosecutor's job to prove, we use the phrase, without a shadow of doubt, that certain things are so. So Paul should be having the advantage here, and he's using that, and he's coming to Felix and he's saying, they can't prove this stuff. And he's going to go on and say, if they tried to prove it, they should have had their eyewitnesses. But this I do confess, saying I deny all this other stuff, but this I do confess, that according to the way, he wasn't about to say Jesus, because that would have started the riot again. But according to the way, which they call a sect, a division of the Jewish faith, I worship the God of our fathers, believing everything laid down by the law and written in the prophets, having a hope in God, which these men themselves accept, that there will be a resurrection of both the just and the unjust. That comes straight out of the book of Daniel. The Pharisees believe that, but the Sadducees not so much. So I also take pains to have a clear conscience toward both God and man. Now, after several years, I came to bring alms to my nation and to present offerings. Ding, 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 ding. Felix hears this guy has money. Well, it wasn't his money. He was delivering the money from the churches because Agabus the prophet said there's going to be a famine. And so he was bringing money to present the offerings. But Felix hears money. If Felix really wanted to come to the truth, he could have summoned Lysias from Jerusalem up to Caesarea. Keep in mind, Caesarea, as far as the Romans were concerned, was the Roman capital of Israel. And Lysias probably made who knows how many journeys up to the capital. I know when I worked, I had to go to headquarters many, many times. But Lysias never did get called in by Felix. Felix was looking for some cash to turn Paul loose. Now, after several years, I came to bring alms to my nation and to present offerings. And while I was doing this, they found me purified in the temple without any crowd or tumult. But some Jews from Asia, the guys that tried to stone him in Lystra, they ought to be here before you and to make an accusation, should they have anything against me. Or else let these men themselves say what wrongdoing they found when I stood before the council. What did I do to be here? I'm looking for eyewitnesses. You don't have any. Other than this, one thing that I cried out while standing among them, it is with respect to the resurrection of the dead that I am on trial before you this day. But Felix, having a rather accurate knowledge of the way, put them off, saying, when Lysias the tribune comes down, I'll decide your case. So basically saying, we're going to compare notes. That's what he told the Jews. He never talked with Lysias. He kept Paul in prison. Then he gave orders to the centurion that he should be kept in custody, but have some liberty, and that none of his friends should be prevented from attending to his needs. So which friends got to attend to his needs? He's in Caesarea. Philip lived there. Philip's 4 daughters that were prophetesses lived there. Cornelius and his household that were saved through the ministry of Philip, they were there. We don't know if Luke was there. And here's another interesting, haunting question for you. If Paul is going to be taken on a prison ship to Italy, how is it that Luke got to go along for the ride? Could it be that Paul's health is already failing him and they said he needs this doctor to get to the prison, to get to Italy alive? We don't know. And it was decided that we should sail for Italy, and they delivered Paul and some other prisoners. He doesn't include himself, Luke doesn't include himself with the prisoners. So somehow Luke is somewhere along the line still connected with Paul. We know that Luke ended up in Rome with him from the different epistles. So Felix says, when I have a convenient time, and let's take that and take a look at today. Some people will know exactly what Christ wants them to do. There have been people that have sat underneath the gospel year after year. There are kids that have grown up in the Sunday school system. There are people that have been testified to many, many times and have not received Jesus Christ. Some choose not to be converted in spite of anything anyone can do to persuade them to be converted. Now, I see that word persuade, and Agrippa uses that when he says almost persuaded. Here's an interesting twist. Our job is not to lead men. Our job is not to lead men to Christ. Our job is to lead Christ to men. It's the Holy Spirit's job to lead men to Christ. So our job is to be messengers. The Bible calls us ambassadors. It's the Holy Spirit's job to do the persuading. And we're going to see that Felix didn't just put Paul, quote unquote, in prison. He's in the palace. He didn't just keep him incarcerated in the palace, but he gave him audience on several opportunities. So Paul had an opportunity. We're going to get to those verses shortly. Paul had an opportunity to talk to Felix repeatedly about the death and the burial and the resurrection, the gospel. And all Felix was looking for was to crack Paul down so he can get a bribe. After some days, Felix came with his wife Drusilla, who was Jewish, and he sent for Paul and heard him speak about faith in Christ Jesus. Verse 26, we used to see the word often. And as he reasoned about righteousness and self-control and the coming judgment, Felix was alarmed. King James says he trembled. He was alarmed and said, "Go away for the present, and when I get an opportunity, I will summon you." Paul spoke to him about righteousness. All of our righteousnesses are as filthy rags, Isaiah tells us. What kind of self-control did Felix have? He stole Drusilla from somebody else. Drusilla was somebody else's wife. He stole her away. Sounds like John the Baptist and Herod. And we'll get to the family tree if I have time. He said, "I'll call you back." At the same time, he hoped that money would be given him by Paul, so he sent for him often and conversed with him. It wasn't like he was just sitting there and letting Paul give him a brain dump of Bible. It was a two-way conversation. And yet, there's no record of Felix ever having received the salvation of Jesus Christ. When 2 years had elapsed, Felix was succeeded by Porcius Festus, and desiring to do the Jews a favor, Felix left Paul in prison. So he's playing one side against the other. He's got Paul in prison, hoping that he could get a bribe. He's got Paul in prison so he could make the Jews happy, even though they hated each other, and never did invite Lysias to figure out what really happened in Jerusalem. So here are some of the players. Here's Pilate. Name means armed with a dart. The Bible talks about the fiery darts coming from Satan in the book of Ephesians. He was removed from office because even though he was threatened by the Jews, if you think that somebody else is going to be the king, then you have no friend in Caesar, they said. They ultimately went back to Caesar, said he's no good, and so they got rid of him. Here's Felix. Great name, means happy or prosperous. He died 2 years after Paul got, that's why Festus came on board. He was married to Drusilla, and we're going to get to a family tree. I got 2 minutes to do that. And he was hoping for a bribe. Here's Festus, another interesting, this is not the guy from the Addams family. Festive or joyous. And he said, Paul, you've got so much intelligence and so much book learning that you've gone crazy. But he got off the hook, as it were, when Paul appealed to Caesar. Now, there's a family tree of the Herod family. And down the bottom right, you see Drusilla, who is married to Felix. Herod means son of a hero, and Agrippa means one who causes pain. What a great name, right? This Herod is the one who killed the babies when Jesus was born, all the boys 2 years and younger. This Herod was the one who killed John the Baptist, and he was the one who had Jesus standing in front of him. John the Baptist said, "You've got a problem, Herod, because Philip, that Herod Antipas' brother, was married to Herodias, Philip's niece. And he said, Philip, too bad for you, I'm taking her." So Antipas marries his niece, and that's why John the Baptist got in hot water, got put in prison, he lost his head. This Herod is the one who killed James the apostle, and this Herod is the one that we're talking about right now in the last few chapters of Acts. This Herod had a terrible disease and finally committed suicide. This Herod was strangled. This Herod had the other Herod exiled. This Herod was eaten up in worms. You can read that in Acts chapter 12. And this Herod had his allegiance to Rome, and we don't hear anything about him after the audience with Paul. And we're going to quickly go through the conversation, then we're going to end. Festus said, "Much learning doth make thee mad." Paul says, "Do you believe the prophets? I know you do." Agrippa says, "Do you think that in such a short time you can persuade me to be a Christian?" And Paul says, "Short time or long, I pray to God that not only you, but all who are listening to me today may become what I am, except for these chains."